So thank you all so much for the time today. Today I'm joined with Perry, and so we expect to have a really interesting and hopefully insightful conversation around the importance of truth in storytelling, but also the importance of pulling through the actual authentic stories of Black people and people of color. So if you don't mind giving our esteemed guest, Perry, a hand, and we'll get started.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrea.
So, Perry, it says here that you are the president and CEO of the DuSable Museum. So, tell us a little bit about your path to that role.
Sure. So, a little bit first about the DuSable itself. We are the oldest independent Black museum in the U.S. And had been known as the DuSable Museum of African American History until our wonderful friends at Zeno Group helped us with this amazing rebranding earlier this year. So we are now known as the DuSable Black Museum and Education Center, and we're very proud of that rebrand. We have been in existence for 61 years this year, and if you speak with Lonnie Bunch at the Smithsonian, who of course was the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture here in DC, he will tell you that there would be no National Museum but for Dr. Margaret Burroughs and the DuSable in Chicago. So we're very proud of being the mothership of Black history museums in the country. My own path, I was really born and raised in the neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, where the museum is situated. Raised my 3 kids going to the DuSable. My oldest daughter's now 40, oh my God. And my 4 grandchildren all had been to the DuSable or have been. And so it really is a personal mission for me to have taken over as president. But myself, I was an architect to begin with, an architect, then received my law degree from the University of Chicago. And I have run billions of dollars of public projects and private projects in and around Chicago and the state of Illinois. Immediately before joining the DuSable, I was CEO of the Illinois Sports Facilities Authority, which is the landlord to the Chicago White Sox. So quite a difference between baseball and a history museum. Absolutely
an amazing intertwined journey that led you here. So let's talk a little bit about the rebranding and the importance of words. So you rebranded from African American.
Yes.
To Black history. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and we, a lot of this has been in the works for several years. I mean, my board of trustees and I have been talking about this for a while. Mostly the part about becoming an education center in addition to a museum. We've always been more than just a museum, right? We're an icon in the Black community and in the city of Chicago. Generally, we are really the only Black institution in the city of Chicago. There are social service organizations and other organizations, but as a museum, as a real arts and culture institution, we're it, right? And after so many years of being an African American history museum, talking to young people, both those who I raised and their friends and a lot of other folks, young Black people don't really call themselves African American so much anymore, right? We feel as though as a people, we have been named by others through history, right? We have been the N-word, we have been Negroes, we have been colored, we have been all of these things. We don't name ourselves that, we name ourselves Black. And that Black identity is a global one, right? So we felt it very important, although we still want to concentrate on the African American historical piece, which is the American historical piece, right? Inseparable, right? You can't unweave one thread of our national sweater and still have a whole garment, right? And so it is not a whole garment without Black history, without the Black contribution, frankly, the free labor that was enjoyed by this nation for hundreds of years. So in addition to the African American story, we want to recognize the Black stories globally, across the diaspora, from the continent of Africa to Caribbean nations, to apartheid, to, all of the things that some of us, really just recently realized with the death of Queen Elizabeth, that not everybody was all broken up about the death of a monarch, right? Mm-hmm. There are different perspectives. And so while Black people are connected culturally across the world, we have different nuances to our stories, right? To our narratives, colonialism, right? Many African nations, most in fact, only achieved their independence in the 70s. And when we talk about Caribbean nations, Barbados was just last year in 2021. Mm-hmm. So all of these stories go into our quilt, and being a global society now, it's so very important that our children, all our children, not just Black kids, but all children, have that knowledge and have access to these narratives that, while they weave together, they're not identical any more than the story of the Holocaust is identical, but it's a very similar story, right? And with the anti-Semitism rise, with the anti-Black rise, with racism rearing its ugly head all across the world, now really was the time to make this branding change and really recognize and acknowledge all of our differences and also our common humanity.
Amazing. So one narrative that I want to take on head on, that is this narrative that Black history began with slavery.
Oh gosh.
So I would love for you to talk a little bit about Equiano, which was at the museum back in February. Can you tell the folks what Equiano was about and how you all were engaged with it?
Sure. So I received a call from a wonderful group of filmmakers in Tel Aviv, Israel, a couple of years ago. And they had heard about us, they'd heard about the work we were doing. They knew that we had an exhibition experience of the march, which is the 1963 March on Washington, in virtual reality, and that Viola Davis had executive produced, she and her husband had executive produced that experience and that film. So they reached out to us because they were making a film called Equiano Stories. The partner's name is Stello Stories, and their first film was called Eva Stories, about a little girl in the Holocaust who told her story as if she had a smartphone and social media, right? So here's a child who really lived, who actually lived during the time of the Nazi occupation, was taken to a concentration camp, but she was telling the story of her family, of her experience, as a child would now, right? But going back in time to that story. Equiano was Stello's second film. The story, again, of a real live person who was born in Igbo land, that's I-G-B-O, Igbo land, which later became Nigeria. And he was born in around 1745. And this film, which we ended up being one of the executive producers on, tells the story of Equiano's childhood, the beauty of African culture, that origin story that began in freedom, not in slavery, right? We usually skip that part, right? All of us, particularly those raised here in the United States, get our education, and it starts with the slave trade, right? It starts with the transatlantic slave trade, and then you touch on Harriet Tubman, and then you touch on Martin Luther King, and then that's the chapter, and it's taught in February, and that's that, right? So much more to us and our culture and our history than that. So we went back to this African culture. That is now the beginning of the story of Black history that we tell. The real Equiano, Oluda Equiano, was enslaved, was working mainly on merchant ships throughout the Caribbean and the UK. He went on in his adulthood to buy back his freedom, to write a book on his experiences. That is the earliest known first-person narrative of an enslaved African. Queen Charlotte was on the throne at the time when he published in the late 1700s, and his activism and the popularity of his story really resulted in the abolition of slavery in England decades before it was abolished here in the United States. So when we look at the different media experiences, when we look at who the narrators are of these stories, nothing is more illustrative of that than Equiano speaking his story, showing his story as social media. So that premiered on Instagram, and it also went on TikTok. TikTok it was a sensation on TikTok. They'd never seen anything like it. I think we have, 850,000 followers. We had within 10 or 12 days over 212 million impressions. And Grant and Zeno, they're trying to teach me the internet speak, the social media speak. So I know there's a difference between impressions and followers and clicks. But I know the biggest number is 212 million. And I know that's important. So TikTok and Instagram both really were instrumental in getting the story out there. You can watch it. Eventually, somebody's going to put all of the shorter stories together into an 85-minute show, and we're excited for that to happen as well. And we're working on an Equiano curriculum that we can introduce to various school districts across the country now. Again, the origin story, freedom. Right?
Yes, and we were so happy and grateful to be your partners in that. Yes, Perry, focus on the big number.
Yes,
the big number.
Big numbers.
All right. So
and great partners like Zeno.
Thank you. Yeah, we got you.
I thought I had a big enough mouth. I didn't need it.
So as communicators, the topic of storytelling is super important, right? Because that has a huge weight on what we do every single day. We talk about the growing buying power of multicultural populations, specifically African American. Can you draw a connection between storytelling and the buying power?
Sure. So I'm not sure what our defined buying power is at this point. I think it's approaching 2 trillion. I'm not sure if that is accurate. I think it's much more, much bigger than that. I don't know that number, how it was researched, but does it include biracial households? Does it include multicultural households, right? And either way, it's a pretty big number, right? And I'm taken back to one of the real pioneers in the advertising industry for the Black advertising market, and that is the great Tom Burrell, Chicago native Tom Burrell Advertising. And he famously said to his colleagues and clients, Black people are not just dark-skinned white people.
Wait, can you say that one more time?
Yes, Black people are not just dark-skinned white people. Right? And so you can't market in a credible way to the Black purchasers, I think the large majority of which are women, by the way, with the same message and the same images that you would use for a white audience. There are cultural specificities, there are historical experiences, and the last session on healthcare, I think is probably a good example, right? Because it puzzled a lot of people as to why Black folks didn't want to take vaccines, right? Until you know the history of the Tuskegee experiments, right? Until you know the history of Henrietta Lacks, right? And her tissue being taken without her permission and now curing a whole variety of diseases, right? So history is always important. And how you present something to someone who you are selling or want to sell something to is incredibly important. And so not only the message, but the messenger needs to be authentic, right? It needs to be credible. And I think that's something that the ad world is understanding, particularly as we start to look at the concentration on DEI and the acceptance of the fact that everything is not white-centric, right? That is not the baseline that everyone uses and that everyone refers to and that everyone recognizes, right? And so such an important factor is that narration and those images and who is telling the story and how that story is relevant to me as a consumer or you as a consumer, right? It's a little bit different, and those differences need to be recognized and respected.
Amazing. So, can you talk to us a little bit about the founder of the DuSable Museum and how you helped to make his vision come alive?
Sure. So Dr. Margaret Burroughs, along with other community leaders, was an educator first and foremost, right? So now naming ourselves an education center is really just kind of repeating the obvious that we know to be obvious, but I think for the philanthropic world and the funding world, it's good to put it in your name, right? All museums are really educational institutions in one way or another, but we are especially that, right? And so Dr. Burroughs was an art teacher and educator, and she recognized in the 60s, right, the early 60s, recognized it really before that, but founded the museum in 1961 in her home, right? But she knew that there was a dearth of Black history storytelling, a dearth of exhibitions on Black excellence and a recognition of all of the stories in history that were either rewritten or truncated or never told at all, right? It was only when the film was made about the Black computers at NASA that we knew about that story, right? What an important role Black women played in the launch of the space race, right? And there's so many stories like that. But if you don't get those who experienced it to narrate those stories and tell us why they're important, right? And for children especially, you know, it's hard to be it if you can't see it, right? And that is the truth for every culture, really, whether it is Asian or Muslim or Black or Jewish, right? I mean, look at these stories that we are learning about just now, and that is because we have had a lack of active narrators or curators or storytellers that have been able to have access to the audiences and to the institutions to tell those stories.
Amazing. So I dug into your archives, your photo archives, and I found a lovely photo of you and a very distinguished gentleman.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about the photo.
Yeah, that is the French ambassador to the U.S. Who came to Chicago in 2021 to give me my credentials as a chevalier. So it's really quite an honor to be a chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters. It's one of the highest honors that the French government can bestow, one of the 4 honorary titles that they give. And this is, you know, not just because I drink a lot of French wine, although I do, but it is because of that connection between the DuSable, the projects that we have done with French institutions, with French partners, and excuse me, really the history that we have brought to the fore of Black people in France, right? So many of our Black American artists, performers, the singers, the writers fled to Paris, right? And they fled to Paris to escape Jim Crow, to escape the racism that existed here in the US. And that was kind of the beginning, well, actually, the beginning was our showing up with our Black troops in World War One, and the French embassy actually partially funded our World War One centennial exhibition that told the story of our Black troops from Illinois and Chicago who were deployed to the Western Front and fought under French command, obviously because the U.S. Army was segregated, and they were some of the most decorated in all of World War One, winning or being bestowed more croix de guerres than most of the other troops throughout the war. So we have a history of, I want to say, maybe a dozen or more projects that we have done with French museums like the Palais de Tokyo in Paris, and others that really, again, make those global connections, talk about that history, talk about the commonality of artistry and the recognition of the importance of the Black story.
Well, you said that so humbly, but I still want the audience to give you a round of applause because that is an amazing, amazing honor. So you touched on the global aspect.
Yes.
What would you love for the global impact to be coming through your work at the DuSable Museum?
Children, right? Really our youth. If we learn nothing else during COVID, it is now how easy it is to connect people across the globe, and especially children, and the importance of that technology to teaching, to education, to making, again, those human connections across the world. So how important is it as here we face, I'm trying to behave myself.
You've been on such good behavior so far.
I'm reaching my time limit. But when I look out and see these attempts to legislate continued ignorance, right? To legislate continued ignorance of history by censoring books, even dictionaries in the not so great state of Texas, or was it Florida? Or they're kind of the same. But how do you censor dictionaries? How do you censor literature? How do you censor history? We're where we are now because of a lack of knowledge and awareness and education of history. So, now is really the most important time to teach all children, right? All students, all adults, we're the ones who need it probably the most. Where we have come from, what has happened, why we are in some of the circumstances we're in today, but most importantly, how do we make good history together going forward, right? You can't fix it if you don't know how it got broken in the first place, right? And so the denial of learning, which personally I think has got to be unconstitutional on multiple levels, really makes us want to step up our advocacy as well. We're a 501c3 arts and culture organization. We cannot be political, we cannot campaign, we can't be involved in politics per se. But every Black person in this country knows you can't be Black in America without being political, because the politics determine the policy, and the policy more than often tells our story and hurts us the worst, right? The effect of that policy that is born of ignorance or a lack of vision or a lack of historical knowledge is why we are now seeing the circumstances that we're seeing today. You know, one of the things we have done at the DuSable is we've brought in police officers, right? And we've given police cadets a historical context of the city of Chicago and the various communities in Chicago. And some of you may know that Chicago was a very segregated city historically, right? And there are reasons for distrust of the police. There are historical facts that continue to be uncovered that are reasons why you don't get witness cooperation. That is born out of fear, not only of the perpetrators, but also of the police themselves, right? So when we bring in police cadets and we say, this is the history, this is this community, this is that community, here are the statistics, here are the reasons why, if nothing else, it makes them a little more understanding of and a little more aware of those relationships and why they are the way they are, and gives them a broader perspective on policing the communities that they are sent to, and they are communities that more often than not don't look like them. Right? And so that type of education for public servants, be it police, fire, and others, is incredibly important. And again, young people, right? So we're working on a couple of projects now where we are actually working with two of our friends, Chance the Rapper and Vic Mensa, who's also a hip hop artist and a visual artist and a fashion designer, because young artists don't get don't want to be categorized, right? You look at young architects and artists and rappers and musicians and visual, they do a little bit of everything, right? That's how it is. You know, you're not just one thing. And so Chance and Vic are working on an educational program with some kids in Ghana, right? And so we're going to be connecting children in Ghana that are school kids and high school age and college age youth with similar youth in Chicago, and through art and through music. And we also are working with our other partner, United Airlines, to help put together these sponsorship packages so we can bring kids from Ghana to Chicago, and we can bring kids from Chicago to Ghana. Again, understanding that we are connected through Blackness, through aspects of the culture, through aspects of history, but not exactly the same, right? We also work a lot with the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. A few years back, it was 2018, pre-COVID, we took the stage play Anne and Emmett, which was a story of Anne Frank and Emmett Till meeting in a place called Memory and talking about their lives and their families and their deaths, both at the hands of racial and religious hatred, right? Again, that thread, that connecting tissue between human historical narratives, right? So very important. And so that's really what I'm looking forward to as we bring in more technology, as we bring in more global partners now. I have a partner on almost every continent now, and that's exciting. And so that connectedness and that spreading of the narrative, and also allowing more and more people to take the mic, pass the mic. And that's very relevant to what all of you do in the field of marketing and advertising as well.
Very inspiring work, Perry. Thank you so much. And very good examples of demonstrated good history being made together. We really appreciate the time. Thank you, Paul and team. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much.